What is commonly regarded as reality is largely shaped not by external circumstances but by the inner world. The human brain constantly interprets the surrounding space through the prism of past experiences, established beliefs and patterns, which often remain unconscious. Scientific studies show that approximately 95% of the thoughts that arise in the mind are a continuous repetition of the same scenarios, with most of them being tinged with negative tones. This means that the perception of external reality is often just a reflection of internal processes. Consider a typical example. Two people lose their jobs on the same day. For one, this becomes a crushing blow, a feeling of complete loss of everything that mattered. The other sees it as an opportunity to start with a clean slate, change careers, and grow as a person. The difference between them lies not in the fact of dismissal itself, but in the meaning they attach to this event. The first believed that his value was determined by his position, while the second understood that work is not a defining factor of his personality. The same event creates two completely different realities. This clearly demonstrates that a person's reaction is determined not so much by objective facts, but by the interpretation of these facts, the story that the mind tells about what is happening. And if this story is based on old fears, unresolved traumas, or limiting beliefs, life seems more chaotic and unpredictable than it actually is. But here's what's important. This vicious circle is not inevitable. Mental models can be reprogrammed. At the moment when a person begins to observe their thoughts from the side, without identifying with each of them, it becomes possible to react to what is happening in a new way. There are still many discoveries ahead about the nature of human consciousness. Stay with us so you don't miss the most interesting. In the next chapter, we will take a detailed look at the reasons why people, realizing their recurring mistakes, nevertheless find themselves in their power. We will examine the mechanisms that force us to act automatically and suggest strategies for getting out of this state, allowing us to regain control over our own lives. Have you ever felt that, despite a sincere desire for change, you seem to get stuck in the same behavioral scenarios? Have you noticed how predictably you react to certain situations, whether it's conflict, a feeling of rejection, or loss of control? It's not a lack of willpower, but the fact that at such moments the autopilot takes over. Our brain, striving for maximum energy efficiency, turns frequently repeated emotional and behavioral reactions into automatic habits. A study conducted at Duke University showed that about 40% of our daily actions are performed not on the basis of conscious decisions, but under the influence of automatic habits. This means that almost half of our life consists of unconscious repetition. Imagine a person who, from a young age, learned the lesson of avoiding confrontations. Even as a child, he realized that expressing his own position could provoke disagreements, and chose the path of silence. Now, even in situations where he could clearly and concisely express his point of view, he prefers to remain silent, not out of personal desire, but out of the conviction that silence is a safer option. This behavioral pattern has taken root and become automatic, affecting all areas of his life, from reacting to critical comments to overcoming disappointments and accepting challenges. We are talking about mental scripts that have formed over many years and are triggered involuntarily, often without awareness. However, there is also good news. This autopilot can be deactivated, although it will not happen by itself. The first step towards change is to become aware of the moment when an automatic reaction is triggered. It is this awareness that opens up space for choosing alternative behavior. In the future, it will be considered how the desire for total control over the surrounding world only intensifies this dynamic, and how exactly this desire keeps a person within the framework of a familiar scenario. In the modern world, one of the main reasons for concern has become the obsessive idea of subordinating uncontrollable factors to one's will, such as other people's views, final results, and future events. Paradoxically, the stronger a person strives for total control, the more he is overcome by a feeling of insecurity. This is because the human brain dislikes unpredictability, preferring a negative but familiar outcome to an unclear, even if potentially more favorable option. That is why many people continue to cling to uncomfortable circumstances, a disliked job or outdated relationships, believing that in this way they maintain the illusion of control. However, it's important to recognize that such control is merely an illusion. One can meticulously develop plans, diligently prepare, and exert maximum effort, but it's impossible to fully anticipate the actions of others, the events of tomorrow, or phenomena beyond personal influence. A prime example is interpersonal relationships, where attempts to change a partner, to subjugate their behavior, speech, and decisions to one's own will are common. Typically, these attempts are doomed to fail, leading to disappointment, conflict, and emotional exhaustion. After all, at its core, the desire to control another person is nothing more than an escape from one's own insecurity. This behavioral model is reflected in various aspects of human activity. People who strive for impeccable planning, driven by fear of potential failures, repeatedly refine their messages before sending them out into the world and expend considerable effort anticipating all sorts of unexpected occurrences. However, as practice shows, this approach does not bring peace, but only intensifies internal tension. Scientific research convincingly demonstrates that people who experience an acute need to control a situation are more prone to stress and have reduced resilience to disappointment. Herein lies the key point. Acknowledging the impossibility of controlling absolutely all aspects of life is not tantamount to surrender. Rather, it's a reorientation of efforts toward those areas where influence is indeed possible, one's own decisions, reactions, and personal attitude toward what is happening. It would seem that nothing could be simpler than keeping silent, yet for many it turns out to be an almost unbearable task. Even a few minutes spent without external stimuli cause an inexplicable feeling of discomfort. Therefore, most people immediately reach for their phone, turn on the TV, or create some background noise just to avoid being alone with their thoughts. There is a perfectly explainable reason for this discomfort with silence. When external sounds subside, internal noise comes to the surface, exposing exactly what the person is trying to avoid: self-doubt, fears, and unresolved disappointments. Silence is frightening in its ability to reveal what is usually hidden behind a veil of everyday worries and bustle. A study conducted at the University of Virginia vividly demonstrates this. During the experiment, many participants preferred to experience mild electric shocks rather than spend 15 minutes in silence and alone with their thoughts. This fact testifies to how strongly people strive to avoid being alone with their own minds. In the modern world, one can often encounter people constantly striving for busyness, whose lives seem like a continuous series of tasks and challenges. From the outside, they radiate productivity, but if they are only left alone with themselves for a moment, they are overcome by an inexplicable feeling of emptiness. Unable to bear this oppressive state, they again rush into work, driven not by necessity, but by fear of the silent inner space. This endless race keeps the mind in constant tension, preventing it from truly being present in the moment. But such activity comes at a price: emotional burnout, loss of clarity of thinking, and a chronic feeling of dissatisfaction become faithful companions. The way out of this vicious circle lies in rethinking the attitude towards silence. It is important to stop running away from it, learning to use it as an opportunity to hear oneself. This is not about exhausting, multi-hour meditations, but about gradually getting used to one's own internal rhythm without constantly trying to fill it with something. Genuine presence in the moment is not an ephemeral mystical concept, but a tangible and useful skill applicable in everyday life. Being present means being aware of what is happening here and now, not allowing thoughts to wander into the past or worry about the future. It would seem simple, but in practice it turns out to be not so easy. How often is a person physically present in one place but mentally in a completely different one? This happens because the brain is constantly trained to be distracted. People live in anticipation, continuously pondering plans for the future and mentally solving problems that have not even arisen yet. A study conducted at Harvard University revealed that on average people spend about 47% of their time thinking about something unrelated to their current activity. It is noteworthy that the more often this happens, the lower the level of well-being reported by the study participants. The great news is that everyone has the opportunity to transform their lives with simple exercises. One of the most effective methods is mindful breathing. It is enough to interrupt one's race for just a moment, focusing all attention on the act of inhaling and exhaling. This simple technique allows you to break the chain of endless thoughts and return to the here and now. Another useful tool is the practice of body scanning, sequentially directing your attention to different parts of the body, trying to feel the sensations that arise without giving them any evaluation. Surprisingly, these exercises do not require a lot of time. They can be performed for a few minutes during breaks, in the middle of the workday, or between tasks. Over time, this training can change a person's habitual reactions. Gradually, an awareness comes of the moment when they begin to immerse themselves in automatic mode, and more opportunities arise for conscious actions. Being present in the moment is not just a pleasant pastime, but a starting point for any significant change. It is important to understand the fundamental difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an integral part of human existence. Losses, disappointments, and unpleasant surprises are inevitable in life. Suffering, on the other hand, is an additional layer that we create on top of pain, often unconsciously. Consider a simple example. Two people are going through a breakup. The first experiences pain, lives through grief, allows themselves to feel these emotions, and eventually moves on. The second, in addition to pain, begins to fuel negative thoughts. I will never be happy again. This always happens to me. I'm not good enough. This additional layer is suffering, which is optional and only exacerbates the situation. Numerous scientific studies confirm this pattern. In particular, a study published in the authoritative Journal of Happiness Studies convincingly demonstrates that our interpretation of negative events directly affects the strength and duration of the suffering experienced. In other words, the key factor keeping a person in a state of emotional pain is not the event itself, but the meaning they attach to it. It is important to emphasize that this is not about ignoring pain or creating an illusion of well-being. Experiencing feelings is an integral part of the healing process. The problem arises when a person becomes so identified with their pain that it becomes an integral part of their self-identity. In this case, any changes are perceived as a threat to their self-perception. An effective way to overcome suffering is to give pain space without fighting it. It is important to recognize and accept your feelings, give them names, understanding that the ability to feel is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of presence. It is this approach that reduces the intensity of suffering. When a person stops fighting pain, it gradually recedes. Otherwise, it only intensifies and becomes entrenched. Attachment is a concept that extends not only to interpersonal relationships, it also refers to expectations and the desire for everything to conform to our ideas. The stronger a person adheres to a fixed idea of what life should be like, the more suffering they experience when reality does not meet their expectations. This refers to all sorts of life situations, unfulfilled plans, people whose behavior differs from expectations, an idealized idea of oneself. Attachments, these mental constructs, often turn into real emotional shackles. As a clear illustration, consider the example of a specialist who continues to do something that has long lost all interest for them year after year. They realize this, feel it almost daily, but do not dare to change, remaining captive to the belief that changing their professional path will be tantamount to personal collapse. In this case, they are held not so much by the work itself as by the image of themselves that they have built around it. Another common example is the desire for total control in interpersonal relationships. A person is convinced that harmony will reign only when their partner changes, and stubbornly clings to this expectation, repeatedly experiencing disappointment when reality does not correspond to the scenario they have invented. Studies in the field of behavioral psychology show that the intensity of emotional suffering directly depends on the strength of attachment, because attachment, in essence, transfers the center of the inner world outward, into a sphere where there are no guarantees. Letting go of control is not a sign of defeat, but rather an act of accepting the inevitability that not everything is subject to human will. Recognizing this fact allows a person to free themselves from the rigid dependence of their internal state on external factors. When the obsessive idea that everything must happen according to a pre-established scenario is released, a new perspective opens up. The opportunity to enjoy the present moment, rather than living in captivity of illusions and unfulfilled hopes. The internal dialogue that a person has with themselves has a tremendous impact on their emotional state, the decisions they make, and their confidence in their own abilities. Surprisingly, this process of self-communication often occurs on a subconscious level, eluding conscious control. It is worth considering how a person reacts to their own mistakes and blunders. Often people tend to self-flagellation, criticism, and comparing themselves to others. Such thoughts, which at first glance seem harmless, actually have serious consequences for mental health. Scientific research shows that people prone to negative internal dialogue are more likely to experience stress, anxiety, and depression. It is as if an implacable critic settles in their minds, constantly undermining their self-confidence. Consider a specific example. A person forgets about an important meeting at work. A healthy inner voice in such a situation would suggest, "What happened, happened. What can I do now to fix the situation?" However, often an individual hears within themselves only the echo of defeat, convincing them of their own inadequacy and loss of trust from others. Such an internal monologue not only does not contribute to solving the problem, but also exacerbates the feeling of guilt, paralyzing any constructive actions. It is at this moment that the need to rethink and readjust the internal dialogue comes to the fore. This is not about self-deception or mindless repetition of positive affirmations, but about critical analysis of automatic thoughts and replacing destructive judgments with constructive questions. Instead of the self-flagellating statement, "I never succeed at anything," it is more appropriate to ask yourself, what lessons can I learn from this situation? At first glance, this minor linguistic change can radically transform a person's reaction to life's circumstances. It is impossible to completely silence the stream of thoughts, but it is quite possible to change the tone in which an individual addresses themselves. This transformation entails profound changes. Self-esteem increases, a positive attitude towards challenges is formed, and mental health is strengthened. Resilience to life's adversities lies not in silent endurance, but in the ability to transform pain into valuable experience. When a person realizes this truth, they stop perceiving difficulties as insurmountable obstacles, beginning to see them as an integral part of their personal growth and development. Imagine a situation: a person suddenly loses their job. The initial reaction can be overwhelming, despair, crippling fear, bitter disappointment. However, over time, this painful loss can become a point of transformation, a starting point for new achievements. There are numerous examples of people who, facing dismissal, decided to start their own business, drastically changed their professional field, or finally found an occupation that perfectly matched their inner needs and aspirations. Of course, the path to change was thorny and difficult, but ultimately led to positive transformations. Research published in the authoritative journal Psychological Science confirms that people who have successfully gone through difficult trials and managed to rethink their experience demonstrate a higher level of life satisfaction in the long term. The pain experienced does not disappear without a trace, but it becomes a powerful catalyst for positive change. It is the ability to cope with pain, and not its absence, that is the key factor distinguishing those who drown in the abyss of despair from those who emerge from the crisis renewed and strong. In pivotal moments, it is important to ask yourself the right question, not "Why did this happen to me?" but "What can I do in this situation?" It is important to realize that resilience to life's adversities does not arise spontaneously in a moment of crisis, but is formed gradually through daily, seemingly insignificant decisions. Emotional self-care, the development of self-awareness, and the ability to create a pause between an external stimulus and your reaction, these are the bricks from which inner support is built. The inner world is not a gift that can be acquired by chance. It is the result of painstaking work on oneself. This work consists of being able to observe your thoughts without succumbing to impulsive reactions, in taking a deep breath before giving vent to anger, in being able to disconnect from the outside world in order to restore connection with oneself. The attitude to the surrounding world is formed through simple but steadfast actions. Imagine a person who has experienced a hard day at work, filled with criticism, stress, and complete exhaustion. Returning home, he may be tempted to vent his accumulated frustration on loved ones who are completely uninvolved in his problems. An alternative is to acknowledge his own feelings, take a deep breath, and pause before reacting. This choice is of immense importance. Modern neurobiological research confirms that the brain possesses remarkable plasticity. This means that the more often a person practices a particular behavior pattern, the more firmly established it becomes in their neural network. This rule applies to both impulsive reactions and conscious responses. Developing mindfulness, changing one's inner dialogue, and learning to let go of negative thoughts and emotions all require constant practice and repetition. Simple understanding is not enough. It is necessary to apply these principles in real life. It is important to realize that this path will not always be easy. One will inevitably make mistakes, experience moments of confusion, and forget one's intentions. However, each time one makes the decision to return to the chosen path, even after a setback, one strengthens the new neural connections that lead to inner peace and harmony, independent of external circumstances. Step by step, the practice of mindfulness allows one to gain stability and emotional independence. It is at this moment that all the elements come together, because if the reader has reached this point, their perception has already undergone a change. The awareness they have gained in the process of reading is a valuable asset. The choice they make based on this awareness will determine their future path. The future is not something distant and uncertain. It is born in how one chooses to live each moment of their life.